Different literary criticisms can be applied to different works of literature. They're very interesting because you can learn about a new literary criticism and then go back and read your favorite book that you've already read a million times, and you could have a completely different perspective. You could either love it more or hate it just because of the literary criticism that you're applying to it. Today, specifically, I'm applying a Marxist criticism to The Handmaid's Tale, and I am using the ideas of cultural conditioning to back up my claim. I'm going to talk about how tradition can lead to denial. And my name is Tess McConkie. Just to give a background about what cultural conditioning is, the official definition of cultural conditioning is factors in our everyday life that affect how we perceive the world around us. The whole point of this is that we don't know that these factors exist. One example would be if you grew up in an urban area versus a more rural area. If you grew up in an urban area, you might just have a faster paced mentality. You might always be in a hurry, where if you're in a rural area, you might be more relaxed, more calm. This is just an example. One example that I saw in my everyday life is I grew up in a very small town, and it's normal for us to wave when you drive by people who are walking or people who are outside if you're driving by a residential area, and you just wave at them even if you don't know them, because it's such a small town, the odds are that you probably know them. But if you did this in a large city, people might think that you're creepy or weird. It might not be as normal. And according to Critical Theory Today by Tyson on page 56, the ideology or belief system of a group of people comes from their cultural conditioning. So how does this apply to The Handmaid's Tale, you may be thinking? The Handmaid's Tale the setting is Gilead, and it's a patriarchal regime in which the women's sole purpose in life is to basically serve men. The handmaids are only to have children for the commanders, and the wives and econo wives and the Marthas basically cook and clean. They don't have jobs, they don't have hobbies, they don't have anything else, they don't have any rights. Their only purpose is to serve the men. And you think, why wouldn't they just all team up and revolt, or why don't they just leave, or why don't they just refuse? The one way that Gilead is so successful is because it uses this cultural conditioning to make its people follow the very strict rules and guidelines. And 3 examples of this cultural conditioning can be seen in the Red Center, at the salvaging, and when Aunt Lydia refers to the next generation. This image shows a scenario that's taking place at the Red Center in which the handmaids are practicing for the ceremony. The ceremony is where the handmaid gets impregnated by the commander, and it's very formal and there are very strict rules with it, and the wife sits behind the handmaid. The handmaid doesn't just show up on her first day of the job and does this for the very first time. They make them practice over and over at the Red Center to normalize it through cultural conditioning. Another example at the Red Center would be they basically are brainwashing them. They make them renounce their old lives by making them admit their old sins. And Janine is shown in the center of all the handmaids, and she just admitted that she was raped at a very young age. And the handmaids are forced to chant at her that it's her fault and she led them on. Even if they don't believe it or not, the act of them being forced to do this over and over is seen to condition them to believe this ideology. As Offred says, we meant it, which is the bad part. And the most extreme example of cultural conditioning throughout the book, in my opinion, would be the salvaging. The salvaging, basically, Aunt Lydia gets on stage and is talking about a guardian who is accused of raping a handmaid, and she incites so much anger in the handmaids that it drives them to kill the guardian. Even if they didn't want to, or they're not murderers, they've never committed crimes in the past, they're just normal women, all the cultural conditioning and the basically brainwashing they have done to them at the Red Center and throughout Gilead drives them to kill him. And even though they might not want to do it, as it says they're screaming and crying in the book, Offred states that an urgency coming through us like a wave when she's talking about them. They stoned him to death. And this is on page 279 of The Handmaid's Tale. Another example of cultural conditioning, which would be extreme, complete cultural conditioning, is when Aunt Lydia says that for the next generation, it will be so much easier on page 162. She's talking about the next generation of handmaids. If they are going to be born into Gilead to become a handmaid, they're not going to have any other background to compare it to. They're not going to have anything to compare it to. The cultural conditioning is so incomplete because they're going to be completely immersed in the patriarchal regime of Gilead, and the ideas are going to seem normal to them because they're not going to have anything else to compare it to. And just to leave you with an interesting thought, I found an article written by Dodson from 2010 that compares America to Gilead. It talks about how we may always think America is this heroic nation, we always do the right thing, but there may be some things, especially in the past, that have not been so great. And how this can relate to the Handmaid's Tale would be slavery. Now we know, obviously, slavery was not good. It was something that we don't have today because it was bad, but at the time the government even perpetuated it. African Americans were called savages. They weren't allowed to read, which is similar to the handmaids. They're not allowed to read. Completely reduced rights. It perpetuated this denial and made them feel less guilty, perhaps even, for enslaving a fellow human, because they considered African Americans less than human. Even with the 3/5 compromise, the government had a law that said that African Americans only counted as 3/5 of a person. So this was a way to dehumanize them and allow it to be easier to enslave African Americans. And they also do techniques like this in The Handmaid's Tale to make it easier to see them as less than human. And this is an example of how literary criticism can be very important and can give you a new idea or approach to looking at a book rather than just what comes to mind when you first read it. Going back and thoroughly analyzing it based on these criticisms is very important. And here are my sources.